Welcome to the Chaos Whispers of Healthcare, the podcast for busy healthcare leaders who are ready to get out of survival mode so they can focus on what matters most. This is where the burnout stops and the real talk starts. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Carter, and each week I sit down with healthcare innovators who get it. We will unpack the chaos, laugh through the hard stuff, and get you at least 2 practical tips you can use at work right away. If you're ready to clear the chaos and lead with impact, you've come to the right place. Let's jump in. Welcome back to the Chaos Whispers of Healthcare, the podcast for busy healthcare leaders who are ready to clear the chaos and lead with impact. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Carter, and today's guest has spent more than 3 decades leading in healthcare and more than 2 of those decades serving as a chief nursing officer. And one thing I loved from my planning conversation with her was this idea that the longer you lead, the more your perspective changes, and it should, because leadership becomes less about having all the answers and more about helping people navigate uncertainty. So today's guest is Julie Holt, who is the Vice President of Patient Services and the Chief Nursing Officer at the Christ Hospital in Cincinnati. She has over 35 years of nursing leadership experience. Similar to me, she started out as a critical care nurse and then walked through and led through an executive leadership journey. We are so excited to have you, Julie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, Julie, after 35 years of leadership, what do you believe about leadership today that you absolutely did not believe when you first became a leader?
No, I think it's what you hit on exactly, Megan, is when I first became a leader, I felt like I needed to have all the answers and I owed that to my team. And my first leadership job, of course, was a charge nurse role, but then quickly was an assistant manager role. And, it's very stressful to need to know all the answers. So I think over the years, what I've learned is that the best answers don't come from me, they come from a team. And not only is that less stressful for you as a leader, but it brings you joy when you're successful as a team. So that's probably my biggest change.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful one because it's so common. And I think it's understandable because we go from being an expert bedside clinician to a novice leader, and it's so uncomfortable. And so feeling the pressure to have all the answers, I think is probably more common than we would believe, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So when you look back on your leadership journey, what leadership transition do you think challenged you the most?
I think it was going from being a unit manager to being a director. And I think that was the hardest for 2 reasons. One is because leading other leaders is different. So it's almost like you're new again at this leadership thing, because leaders have ideas, opinions, things they want to do, and they manage their days and they're accomplished. And so learning how to lead and inspire them is a little different than leading and inspiring frontline staff. Yeah. But it's also different because as you're promoted, the organization expects different things from you. So as a frontline leader, you're expected to operate a unit, to understand the day-to-day, to be in the weeds of what's going on in that area. When you're promoted, you have to learn yet again another skill set to lead at a different level where the outcomes that you have to deliver on may be different and much bigger.
Yeah, that's a big point. I think my biggest transition for me, similar to yours, but was going from being a supervisor, assistant nurse manager into manager. I remember that being like a sudden pivot, and suddenly I'm accountable for a multi-million-dollar department, all of these outcomes, and I can't control, right, what the clinicians are doing, but you're accountable to it. And so you carry that with you as a director, as an ACNO, and so on and so forth. The responsibility and accountability expands, and you have less and less control or input on how the work gets done.
Right.
So that locus of control is just, I know it's anxiety ridden for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the control piece too, because it does change. The more people that get involved, the less control you have.
Absolutely. And just in case anybody's wondering, control is an illusion in healthcare leadership, you guys.
It is. It 100% is.
Absolutely. So, Julie, what's kept you passionate about nursing and leadership for so many years?
I think for me, number one, it's just nursing. It's who I am. I'm proud of it. We are very special people, in my opinion. We run in when everyone else is running out. We have the ability to make people feel comfortable in a matter of minutes at the worst points, most vulnerable times of their life. So being a nurse is just inspiring to me and something that I'm very proud of. But the other part of that is as a nurse, there are so many things that we can do
Yeah.
and so many aspects. So if you would have told me when I was in senior in high school, going into nursing school, that I would be leading the entire department and doing a lot of the business pieces and strategic planning, I would have been like, what? I don't even know what that means. Right.
Right. Right.
So the ability to do different types of, not only in different clinical settings, but then just different types of jobs and roles, I think there's never a boring moment, and it really keeps you engaged and the work is meaningful.
Mm.
There's never a day that you're doing something that you feel like it's not important to your community, to the people you work with, to the patients, those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you pointed that out. And I was reflecting on this with a peer recently, and, where our sense of accomplishment or meaning, it changes over time as you move into these different leadership roles. And, as a bedside person, I can see the difference I'm making right then and there in my patient and their family members. But as
Right.
a leader, it's certainly the higher up you go in the org chart, the less and less you get that feedback. And so, we're going to talk about resilience, but finding other ways to find sense of meaning in your work becomes even more pivotal, I think, especially as a nurse leader.
Right. I agree.
So I think we're going to cover 2 pain points. So the first pain point I want to talk about, and I would love to really get into detail here because you have such a powerful perspective on this. But pain point number 1 is what is keeping healthcare leaders up at night, right? And so you're sitting in a CNO seat today. What keeps healthcare leaders and executives up at night right now?
Well, there are multiple things to choose from, but I think the one that keeps me up at night most frequently is workforce issues.
Mm,
And to me, that is the most important thing because it all comes back to that.
yeah.
If you don't have the right people in the right place at the right time, then it becomes really difficult to deliver on all the other aspects that our, communities expect, like quality and experience and, access and timeliness. It really all goes back to the workforce. So, since the pandemic, it's been a huge challenge, and I think it's something that is a big focus for us still.
Absolutely. Clear. The literature's clear. And of course, you're living and breathing it every day. Why do you think so many of our challenges? So we know US healthcare is the most expensive in the world, right? And we
Mhm.
trail, unfortunately, in a lot of the quality outcomes in different sectors. We rank at the bottom. And you talk about workforce. Why do you think so many of these challenges that we have in healthcare ultimately come back to workforce?
I think that we have not done a great job as leaders of identifying what the workload is out there on the front line clinically over the years. And
Mm,
I think oftentimes we have looked at frontline clinicians, whether it be nursing or other areas, as an expense rather than the necessity to deliver on the results that we're looking for. And I think that is really kind of coming to the ahead right now in our industry. For the first time ever, I was looking at worked hours per patient day benchmarks nationally, and they went up. And I was so excited to see that because I think, if people have too much on their plate, they become overwhelmed. I think we learned a lot from the pandemic. It was bad. We learned what not to do. We learned a lot of things that we could do differently and better.
yeah.
And I think that that's what we owe the workforce, is to really evaluate what is the work and to fund it and give them the chance to deliver on that, on what they signed up for as a clinician. The other thing I think is span of control, and we're
Mm,
doing a lot of work on our frontline nurse managers and their workload as well, anywhere from standard of work to prioritization to just time management and those kinds of things. Because if they are not available for those
yeah.
frontline workers
Yeah.
and team members, then we're shot in the foot right there. You need that level of support.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've done a good job in the industry with that. So we're
Mm.
focusing on a lot of those things right now in my organization, and starting to see some small but important successes.
Yeah. Having had the honor and privilege of meeting your team and doing some work with you guys, it is so clear to me. And I don't think I've met a group that doesn't, but your team genuinely cares about their people. And, we talk about the front line getting to see their manager. It's amazing how many times I'll come do like a keynote or something, and there's a mix of frontline direct care clinicians and leaders. And when I show the frontline people how overwhelmed leaders are across the nation, it's always a big aha moment for them, because often by not seeing their leader, they assume that's because their leader doesn't care or they're not a priority. When in fact, we know the leader cares deeply and is carrying moral distress because they cannot physically get the time to go out and actually engage with their team because they themselves are drowning in administrative burden and meetings. We've talked about all that. I love that your hospital is embracing how to make that better for them, because we know a nurse will stay if they feel supported and seen by their leader and their peers. So I think it's such a powerful point.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think even, that occurs at the manager level, but even as you go through the levels of nursing leadership, I mean, there's one CNO in our organization and there's about 3,000 nurses.
Yeah.
And I hear a lot like, hey, we'd like to see you more. And I think, there is nothing I enjoy more than going out and seeing the team members and talking to them. But I need to be in the boardroom representing them, or sitting at the exec team meetings representing nursing. That is how I serve our nurses. And so I think it's important, for all of us to recognize the different roles and the importance that they play. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of touched on this, but the second pain point I would really like to spend some time on before we get to solutions is what our frontline leaders are carrying. And so, you highlighted that frontline leadership is a major challenge. What are you seeing nurse managers and frontline leaders struggle with most right now?
So I think it's just competing priorities. What we learned in our organization is that I was probably asking them to do less than all the other departments in the organization. I found out that, people were asking them to do this audit or check on this or fill out this report, and these things add up. And we were so grateful when you came in and helped us look at that and, quantify it so that we can actually share that with other people and say, hey, if you want us to do this, then we have to take something else off the plate. So I think that's one area, just competing priorities and just a lot of things. I think another thing is, like a lack of like a standard process and standard work, not knowing exactly, everybody kind of focusing in different areas, and then you end up getting different results. And some of that, you would expect because different units have different issues, but it sometimes makes it harder when people are doing different things and they're not aligned and, how they can deliver on things. So, and then, we talk a lot about the non-value added work. There's a lot of stuff like extra clicks and extra reports and things like that people have to do or get into that are just really not helpful. And we're trying to eliminate those things.
Yeah, you guys are definitely on the leading edge as far as what I see, which is, and I'll share best practice with the group of the listeners, which is you have people who are wanting to add something to, let's say, the nurse manager plate, not to make them work hard for it, but to just justify, like, help me understand the ask. And then what can we take off or pause from their plate to make room for this? And that last question, I feel like, is the one that's missing. And it's not intentionally missed. I think what, like you pointed out, these leaders are being asked to do things by other department heads that the CNO or CEO have no idea about. And so it's easy for managers to get frustrated. Understandable. They have a very difficult job, but they assume, well, I'm just expected to say yes. Right. When in fact, it's really the issue is your senior leaders may not have any clue what you're being asked to do. You can't just assume that. So it all comes back to communication, which I hear you describing so eloquently.
Well, and I think you just brought up a great point. One of the things that we did with your help in a second workshop that we attended was empowering them to say no or to at least ask the question. I need to take this back to my leadership team to determine if this is a priority for us. Love to help, but we have to double check on this. And we're going to have to get more comfortable saying no. Other departments say no. There's only so many people. We have to take calculated risk. We have to know what that no means and then prioritize as an organization, not just as an individual manager who feels like they're drowning.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So well said. So how do leaders, in your mind, because we're going to bridge over to strategies, but how do, in your opinion, how do leaders avoid getting trapped in that constant reaction mode that we're describing?
what we have talked about um, and learned from people who do this better than others is know what your strategic plan is and know what's most important. And when I say
Mm,
that, I mean your organizational strategic plan and goals, but also your own personal
yeah.
goals and what's important to you. And that is key because to me it's all about prioritization every single day. And if it doesn't tie to something that is in your top 5 important list, then it can wait. And you have to be able to articulate that and explain it.
Yeah.
If somebody's expecting something from you, then explain why it's going to be delayed or that you can't do it. I think also managers can learn ways to increase their efficiency. We learned that when we worked with you as well, that there were people who had tips and time savers
Yeah.
that allowed them to get their work done in a much more efficient and effective way. How do you
Yeah.
share those? And
Right.
and then continue to grow that and then look at where everyone is struggling and fix those broken systems. And I look at that as my job. How do I remove those barriers that all of my managers are struggling through? And then, like I said, the ability to say no, the ability to take care of yourself, learning stress management techniques,
Yeah.
learning about resilience and understanding the importance of strategic recovery, and that is necessary for you to be able to go back out there and give again the next day.
Love that. So beautifully said. So you make an analogy too, which I think is great as we kind of transition over to solutions, but you talk about, as we're moving from kind of that operational leader up to that more strategic exec role, you talk about knowing your leadership level and you use a military analogy. Can you share that with the listeners?
Yeah, yeah. Several years ago, I think I was reading a book about leadership that was related to General Ulysses S. Grant. And interestingly enough, I had not really thought about this before as I had progressed through leadership, but I was not a CNO at the time. So I guess it was a long time ago. But anyway, when you are a nurse manager, you are at a level similar to like a captain in the military. And your job is at the front line, running the day to day operations, understanding what needs to be done in order to take care of those patients, right? As you move up through the ladder, and this is what I meant about earlier, what does your organization expect from you as a deliverable? Your job becomes more strategic and it becomes larger. And so as a CNO, I'm at the general level and I need to be thinking not just about the battle that we're fighting today, but that war that we need to win.
Yeah.
And how long is that going to take? And what do we need to do today to get to where we need to be 5 years from now? And that difference is important for not only those of us who are leading to understand, but then also for our constituents because the why becomes different for all the different things that we do. A captain's why is going to be about a patient or about a team member in the moment, and a general's why may be a much more strategic thing like the nursing shortage or some sort of financial change in reimbursement or something like that that's going to affect us. So, yeah, I really became interested in military leading when I opened a new hospital and people were extremely stressed. And I thought, I can't imagine being more stressed than going into battle. So, what do
Right.
people do? And that's when I recognized, some of these nuggets that really can be applied to us in healthcare.
Agreed. And I also add to that, I had kind of had that realization mid-pandemic too, which is the military really has a great way of approaching trauma-informed leadership.
Yes.
And boy, did that become relevant at the height of the pandemic when it's how do I as a leader support my leaders through trauma? They're supporting their clinicians through trauma, which is massive. And then, so it does. And to your
Right.
point, understanding your role and level is huge. That's
Right.
huge.
That's an excellent point. We, as we were going through the pandemic, did the same thing. We did a lot of resilience training with a gentleman who actually worked with the military leaders to help our leaders through that.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's powerful. I love that. So what I'm hearing is sort of a practical tip is understanding, know your level and what your job is at that level and what it's not. So the second strategy we talk about, you call it like a strategic filter. But, one of the things we talked about is the importance of asking, is this ask of me, is this work aligned with the strategic plan? Why is that question so powerful in your mind?
We have something here we call the whirlwind. And that is urgency in your day to day operations. Whether you're a captain or a general, we all face urgent things. And one thing that we've learned from a book that we read called 4DX is that urgency will eat a strategy for breakfast every day. So
Interesting.
it's very important for us as leaders to ask ourselves, am I reacting to something that's urgent? Is it truly urgent? Or does it tie back to the strategic plan? And that's how we prioritize and that's how we filter. It helps you feel like you're accomplishing something. I mean, I think that's important. I think you mentioned earlier as a nurse at the end of your shift, you tie your patient up in a bow and you hand them off to someone else who's going to take care of them, right? And so, yeah, you still think about your patients, but you know that the work is getting done. As a leader, that
Right.
doesn't happen. The work that
Right.
you don't finish today is there for you tomorrow. So
Right.
it will accumulate. And every day you got to keep, what are our top 5 things? So I think knowing your personal strategy and goals and the organizational strategy and goals will help you with
Yeah.
that.
It also helps too, as you're describing this, to justify if I do need to strategically decline a request for whatever
Yes.
reason. So, whatever it is, the justification for that. So if I come to my exec leader, say I'm a director, and say, hey, I've been asked to join this whatever committee, I'm at capacity. I don't see how it aligns with our strategic plan. Can I get your thoughts? That's a really
Right.
powerful discussion to have. You can even have it in the hallway versus just blindly absorbing it or blindly declining it, right? And so again,
Right.
using that strategic plan as a filter with new requests becomes really powerful, as you pointed out there.
Right.
Yeah.
We had a situation too where some of our frontline managers who were new were viewing a task that they were doing, like rounding on their frontline staff on a regular basis. And that they had kind of bucketed that as more of a task instead of a strategy. And we were able to take that back through that strategic plan filter and tie it to our team member culture workforce piece. And it moved,
Yeah.
that this is like, if I don't meet with my team members, then the chance of turnover or errors or whatever, those things all go up. And so this is more of an important task and something that's very, very valuable rather than something I just need to check off. So it works both ways.
It absolutely does. It does. It's
Yeah.
such a brilliant point to make too. I think there's another strategy. So we'll talk about strategy number 3, which
Yeah.
a question that you ask, which is, am I the right person to execute this even?
Great
So
one.
why do you think leaders struggle to let go of execution as they advance into those senior levels?
Yeah, I think that some of that goes back to what we talked about from the military levels. So
Yeah.
you're a captain and you're good at it. You've got your unit and you know it. And the way you have been successful and rewarded is by rolling up your sleeves and diving in, right? As you move up the through the different levels, you need to delegate.
Yeah.
And when I first was promoted as a director, I wanted to keep being a captain. I wanted to keep doing all the things that I knew how to do. They're satisfying. And I like a list just like everybody else, want to check
Yep.
it off and those kinds of things. And I recognized really quickly that I was becoming the bottleneck and the barrier for getting things done
Yeah.
because one person cannot do everything. So,
Right.
depending on whether you want to look at it from the strategic perspective, as I'm supposed to be looking at strategy and long-term goals and connecting the dots for people, that's the preferred way of looking at it. But the other way is just like, you don't want to slow everyone down, right?
Right.
And then, just to tie it back to what we talked about in the very beginning, Megan, is you don't have to have all the answer. The team and the people who do the work, they know
Yeah.
the work best. So let's go back to them. But you as a leader then have to become comfortable with giving some things up and
Yes.
letting people roll on their own. And what you will find is that their answers are way better than yours,
Right. Right.
and that is so rewarding. So
Absolutely. Don't you think too, some of the barrier in that though, because I know I struggle with this as a new director was, okay, so it's not mine to own, it should be my manager's, but we see how
right,
exhausted and spread thin the
right,
managers are. And so that's an easy barrier or not an easy barrier to address. It's a barrier that I think is widespread, and it's feedback that I get from my audiences, which is I sure would love to delegate so I could remain strategic, but I feel bad giving anything to anyone. So can you maybe share an example? This might help with the listeners. Can you share an example where letting go actually made you a better leader as an executive?
yes. So the first example would be what we just talked about. The first time I had this experience, I was a newer CNO and we were working on a throughput project. And to your point, I didn't want to ask people to do what I
Yeah.
thought would be the best thing because I thought it was too much. I thought
Yeah.
it would put them over the edge that I couldn't ask them to do that. But when you let people take work that is meaningful and
Yeah.
is important to them, and that's the second part of the answer, they find the energy. It fills their cup.
Yeah.
The mundane, day to day, boring stuff, that's what drains people, right? The things that you can't see the
Right.
big outcome. But
Right.
if you're feeling guilty about giving something to people to work on, think about the fact that you're giving them an opportunity to do something really impactful for their organization, for their team members. So back to my example, this
Yeah.
team decided that they were going to go to the PACU to get report on their patients. We were having like returns to the OR and returns to the ICU. It was a different
Yeah.
organization than where I'm at now, and they decided that going to the PACU and seeing their patients before they transferred them to the unit would be much better care and that they'd have a really good idea with the level of care they were able to provide, like the nurse to patient ratios, whether or not this patient was ready to move out. I, as a leader, would never have asked them to do that.
Yeah.
I just would think that they wouldn't have enough time, that they would be too busy, those kinds of things. But
Yeah.
they came up with that themselves. And so then you've got this ownership, and they were so
Yeah.
proud of it, and our outcomes improved. And it really re energized the unit.
Yeah.
So if when you're feeling bad about asking people to take something on as a leader, think about what you might be able to take off their plate to give them that space, but also recognize that you're giving them, the opportunity to be excited about something that's going to have a long term impact.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. And that's such a great example of it was almost a walk of faith for you to let go of control and let them do that. You
Oh,
knew
yeah.
that they would struggle, but then seeing the outcome probably just cemented that practice for you, which is such a great example.
Oh, yeah.
That is great. You also we talked about resilience and what we call the power of the pause. So you shared something that I loved, which was, as you were moving up through the roles, you said you did it gratefully and with a lot of work, I have become more resilient. So how has resilience changed for you over the years?
So, being a former med surge and then ICU nurse, things are fast paced. And you kind of get used to that speed. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
And then you start to age and you realize that, you're in this for the long haul and this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So you have to figure out ways to slow down. But for me, I had a lot of guilt with that. Like if I decide, like if I wasn't feeling well or I needed to go home or I was tired or, I'd already worked 10 hours that day or whatever, you go through those things. And then I attended a performance workshop with some of our physicians and they talked about this concept of strategic recovery.
Okay.
And it was so impactful because it was scientifically based, and I'm a scientist. It
Right.
was if you don't take time to recharge and fill your cup,
Yeah.
it's like that cliche on the airplane. If you don't put the oxygen mask on yourself first, you cannot deliver the
Right.
best product to your team. So
Right.
I started trying that and trying to do some things one at a time differently in my life. And I have learned that I am a much better leader because I take that time that I need, whether it be physically time or mentally time to recharge and become a better leader. So I highly recommend it. I wish I would have done it earlier. Everybody says that kind of thing, but it is possible. If I can be reformed, anybody can be reformed. So, okay.
All right. And so one of the last pearls I want to make sure we hit on before we close out the episode, you also talk about being comfortable with what you call the gray. And you said that was one of the hardest leadership transitions. What do you mean by that?
So going back to being a bedside nurse, everything is pretty much evidence based, and there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, and we know
Yeah.
the research back behind it, and all those kinds of things. As you move into leadership, and the more you move up the layers, the answers, whether they come from your team or from you, are more and more elusive.
Right.
They're
Right.
difficult to find, and many times it's not black and white anymore.
Right.
There isn't a right or a wrong. There might be 5 different options and none of them are perfect. which one is best for your organization, or that old saying, the lesser of two evils, that kind of
Right.
thing. Hopefully it's not evil, but you know what I mean? It comes, and I have seen leaders struggle with this. If they are very much black and white thinkers,
Right.
it's either right or it's wrong.
Yeah.
They struggle with that ambiguity that I think that I have become comfortable with. And it's the same skill, it's the same muscle, flexing the same muscle is like turning things over to your team and having them come up with the answer, or knowing that or suspecting that the strategy may not work, being comfortable with failing, but then knowing that you've got to learn from that failure.
Yeah.
Gray means all of those things to me. And so I often talk to new leaders about becoming more and more comfortable with gray.
Yeah, that's just pure wisdom right there. So I'm so glad you touched on that. I wanted to make sure we didn't lose that. So this has already been an incredible conversation. One of the things I like to do with these episodes is kind of end on a high note, because what we talk about is real talk, and being a leader in healthcare is really hard stuff. So to kind of pivot to a lighter note, what is bringing you the most joy outside of work right now?
Well, it's all about that resilience. And so right now, in Cincinnati, the garden is blooming. I'm a big gardener.
Yes.
I can tie that back kind of to this leadership thing from you nurture something, you plant the seed, and then you take the time to watch it grow.
Yeah.
Not that instant gratification. And I've been working really hard in my garden for the last couple months, and it's finally starting to bloom. And it brings me joy every time I look at it or even think about it. So
I love it. I've been joking with people that I've entered what I call my hippie granola granny era, because I love my garden and I love bird watching. It's something other than dealing with human beings. Yeah, absolutely. That's perfect. I love that. Well, Julie, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I know there were so many pearls of wisdom in there. And today's conversation really honestly reminded me that leadership is not about having all the answers. It's about developing the perspective, ask better questions. Questions like, is this aligned with the strategic plan? Am I the right person to execute this? Am I reacting or pausing first? I think those small shifts are what help leaders move from operator to strategist. So thank you so much for your time. And if people want to connect with you further, Julie, where can they find you?
On my LinkedIn profile. I'd be happy to respond there. And Megan, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure working with you and talking to you today.
Same. Thank you so much. And listeners, all of her tips will be in the show notes, and a link to her LinkedIn will be there as well. Thank you for tuning in, fellow Chaos Whisperers. And thank you, Julie, for coming today. Until next time, my friends. Thanks for joining us on the Chaos Whispers of Healthcare. If today's episode resonated with you, please be sure to follow this podcast, rate, and leave a review on your favorite platform. I'm Dr. Megan Carter, and I will be back next week with more real talk, fresh strategies, and guests who are redefining what it means to lead with impact. Want to keep the conversation going? Be sure to connect with me on LinkedIn and download free tools and resources from my website. Both links are in the show notes. Let's heal this broken healthcare system together, one day at a time.